fortunate today to have Don Burkel Jr. come in to talk to us. If you remember, his father came in and gave us a presentation on the Civil War. Young Mr. Burkel here is a 78 graduate of GCC, has gone on, gotten his bachelor's at UB, working on his master's. The family has been involved in going back and forth to Europe, particularly Germany, over quite a number of years. The Burkel family has made connections with a number of the German officers, German high command in World War II. Mr. Burkel has done considerable research in Europe on the German military staff. His master's thesis is going to be on modern Germany. So he's done quite a bit of research, and what he is here today to talk to us about is the German high command, the German military in World War II. It's interesting to understand them, particularly in the light of, obviously, Adolf Hitler, who never rose above the rank of corporal in World War I, being their boss and essentially giving them military orders. And here are men who are trained in the military profession, who know some of the things that he is suggesting probably won't work, and then caught very early on when some of them did work, and what do you do? So let me turn it over to Don, and he can tell us about the German high command in World War II.
Okay, thank you, Paul. First of all, I'd just like to say that I will be talking about the German Officer Corps, but I think it's essential that we understand what the German Officer Corps is or was. In terms of 1939 to 1945, which is what the war years were for the German military in World War II, we would be looking at an officer corps, a general staff, which not only had that particular time for its immediate dominance in the military role of Germany, but we have to look back. It is made up of more than that. It's 270 years of tradition. It is not just 12 years, it was 270 years. Mostly, you will find written stories or histories on the German Officer Corps about World War II. Little is said about why these men did what they did. It was made up of individuals, but within that individual framework, there was an institution which was their guideline. And this is what I'm going to focus on today, using two or three of the main characters that I worked with. In fact, two of the gentlemen, which I can point out to you, did come to Batavia, and one of them was at GCC here in the library in 1972. So we'll start off by pointing out what the whole institution was about. The German Officer Corps was guided by a whole philosophy, a tradition, a set of values, as I said, of 270 years. And when we look at this, we see, for example, a gentleman like this. And what I'd like to ask, first of all, is someone out here, what does this gentleman look like? What does he look like to you, or what might he represent to you? This gentleman right here in the front row.
Looks like a banker.
A banker. Okay, the lady across from him, what would your impression be? Okay. Well, he was someone's grandfather, yes. Ironically, his great-great-grandfather came from Finland in about 1400, and he became one of the leading generals in World War II. His name is Herman Bulk. But this man, whose family evolved through the military system, was a gentleman who himself made a quote once to me, and it's quite interesting. He said, "Outsiders do not ever understand the German military, especially the officer corps, because our discipline and our actions are something that are more within our tradition, and we understand them better." And here is how he evolved from that picture prior to looking as a grandfather as a German officer in World War II. He was a 3-star general. But he did maintain and abide by the disciplines of the German officer corps, which, when Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, things changed for the German officer corps in one sense. It tried to maintain its tradition. General Bulk, of course, was abiding by those rules of tradition and the values set down. But during this period, the greatest change for the German army took place. And that is, it became a mass army introduced to the various levels of society. Prior to this, for over 200 and some years, it had been a very elite army corps. It will stem back to this man here, Frederick the Great. In approximately 1740 to 1788 he reigned. He is probably well known for his mastery in military tactics and also discipline. But the traditions of Bulk go back to this gentleman, and even to his father, Frederick William I, who first initiated the German officer corps in setting down that it will be an elite group of individuals who will be my officers, primarily those men who came from Prussia, across the river Elbe. They were known as Junkers. And an evolution began. Men such as Scharnhorst, he was the man who developed or created the German General Staff, which again in 1945 came to an abrupt end, but was based on tradition and class. We see Clausewitz, a famous writer on military tactics and strategy and philosophy most of all, who at one time said war is just another means of continuing diplomacy. However, he did not promote war as many of his successors would. This was a man who, throughout the evolution in about 1850 to 1880, presented probably one of the greatest threats to the bourgeois, the middle class, liberal element in Germany. The German General Staff and the German Officer Corps were based primarily on, as I mentioned to you earlier, an elite caste system. They were isolated from the average person. If you were a middle class individual, you could not participate or you could not join to become an officer in the German Officer Corps. This was the way it was. This man here, Edwin von Manteuffel, he was a baron who later became a field marshal, was primarily the man who set the tone for over 30 years for the German Officer Corps, in that he cleansed it of any liberal elements. He wanted a pure German Officer Corps based on the Junker or Prussian nobility. This, ironically enough, in 1944, is his great-grandson. It's interesting to note in seeing the field marshal and his grandson, how the evolution was taking place. That from about 1860 to 1945, many of the men who participated in the German Officer Corps or in the German Army of World War II had relatives back to the 1860s and even further. General Hasse von Manteuffel, incidentally, he was the gentleman who was here at GCC in 1972. His family goes back in history, German history, to about 1215 in Pomerania. So they had a very long history in Germany, being prime ministers, military men, and this was part of the evolution, part of the whole structure of the German Officer Corps. He was a nobleman. So he was entitled to be an officer. This was another interesting fact. If you were a nobleman or had been ennobled, you were entitled to be in the officer corps. It was also a way of life. We have to remember that there wasn't a whole lot for these individuals to do. They were not well-educated men. And I'm saying generally prior to his generation. They were not well-educated. They did not have a lot of money. What they did have were large estates. And this provided them the background and perhaps the basis for a military education because it was cheap. If you were in the cavalry, it was a little more expensive. But this was a profession for them. Otherwise, what were they going to do? But as we evolve through the time, we see that General von Manteufel's father had been an officer as well. This is Eckhart von Manteuffel. So his son naturally would have followed. Great-grandfather, son, and now grandson. And here's General von Manteuffel as a cadet. They entered at a very early age. You have to remember, again, the whole process was through heritage, through privilege, and through an occupation. In this case, General von Manteuffel, at this age, didn't have much choice. It was chosen for him. He's at the age of 9 there when he entered a cadet school. The rest of his life would be dedicated to the German officer corps. This again is General Balk, who you saw earlier. And his family is a little bit different now. He was not a nobleman. But if you were an officer, or you came from an officer's family, you were also entitled to be an officer or enter the cadet school. And General Balk's great-grandfather, who came from Hanover, which was another military capital, you might say, in Germany, where many outstanding officers came. There was a very well-known military school there. Again, began the evolution. And this was General Balk's father, who in the First World War was a division commander. So naturally, it would be for General Balk to follow in his father's footsteps and become a cadet as well. So we're seeing this whole development at this elite group of officers who were isolated from the mass, who had controlled the monarch, who had controlled government, because they were not under the Constitution of Germany. They had always remained aloof. They remained under the power of the monarch, the Kaiser. They could even change the budget if they wanted. And, as we will see a little bit later, in World War I, they could even take the advisor of the Kaiser, the emperor, and dismiss him. They had that much power. They were better known as a state within a state, actually. Here we see in World War I, from about 1890 to 1914, beginning, the evolution, again, was based upon the German officer corps and its dominance. However, changes were taking place. Modern Europe was seeing that technologies were entering in. Financial markets were booming. Industrialization was occurring. And due to all of this, again, the idea of modern warfare entered the picture. Germany could no longer remain idle. The German officer corps had to become educated somewhat. Again, engineering was taking a primary role. Artillery was becoming very sophisticated. The introduction of the airplane, things like this. So consequently, at this juncture in the history of the German officer corps, changes were about to take place. They had to somewhat loosen the belt and allow certain middle-class elements in. Upper middle class. And at this particular time, too, it was predominant for many people. For example, if you were a lawyer, to wear a German officer's uniform. This was prestige. It was honor. Not necessarily were you interested in war. That was the least of their thoughts. But the prestige that it represented in the German society, because a uniform had always been this tradition and always stood out. So as we move into the period of World War I, here we see the Kaiser in the middle, we see von Hindenburg on the left, and Ludendorff on the right. The German officer corps at this time, even though allowing other elements into it, became a very powerful force. And at this time, as I mentioned to you previously, they could even dictate to the Kaiser who his advisors were going to be. And eventually, by 1918, they had taken over. It was known as a silent dictatorship. They actually were controlling the war effort. And the Kaiser at one time had said to one of his advisors, "You realize I could go out and pick apples? I have nothing else to do. These men are totally in control." And this was the beginning of the 20th century and the changes that were going to lead up to the Third Reich and what eventually happened. This was the beginning or the demise of the German officer corps as it had been known. Here is another photo of General von Manteuffel. This was during the World War I period. And this type of officer, who was an elite cavalryman, had always distinguished themselves. You can see by his appearance here that they were a very proud type of men, but yet they were not ready for the defeat of World War I. And with the end of World War I, and mind you, with the end of World War I, they lost the one solid pillar that had always kept them an elite group of men. They did not have to worry about a constitution, civil control by a parliament or anything else, because the monarch had always been there to protect them and said, "I run the army." But at this time, the monarch had to abdicate in 1919, and he had to go to the Netherlands. Therefore, men like General Hasse von Manteuffel, as a young lieutenant in a Hussar regiment, had lost the pillar by which the officer corps had developed, and by which he had been educated primarily, prior to World War I and into the 20th century. Along came the Reichswehr government, and with that government, following World War I, came a whole new set of rules. It developed for the first time a constitution, and with this constitution, the German army was bound to a constitution. Civil government, what a change. At first there had been revolution, and the threat of revolution. There was even mutiny by the German soldiers returning from France and from Russia. However, General von Seeckt here was a man who pulled the German army together. Now mind you, he was a nobleman as well. He was putting himself in a position which was going to be extremely difficult by unifying those men who were noblemen, who had been the core of the German officer corps, and getting them to understand that the constitutional government is what is necessary, and that the German officer corps and army would be the core for the Reichswehr and for the future. He had quite a job. The one thing he did do, apart from organizing them over a short few years, was the fact that he did isolate the German officer corps from politics. As they had become quite political in their motivation with the Kaiser, they did interfere in foreign affairs. They dictated to the German government. They were able to decide on chancellors pretty much. And in fact, in World War I, they forced a chancellor out of government because he did not agree with their thinking militarily. The chancellor had no way around dealing with the German officer corps. He had to concede. However, von Seeckt made it very plain that the German soldier and officer were not to participate actively in any type of political party or to take part in the government in any way. And that includes voting. So during this period from about 1923 up to about 1932, the German officer corps, again, even though they were subjected to a parliamentary form of government, rose to a position, this time with the content of more middle class and lower class individuals who were able to become officers. However, their strength as a state within a state did arise because, again, who were they led by? A nobleman. So von Seeckt brought them into a new period in preparation for the Third Reich, which they weren't aware of at this time. Only the rumblings of Adolf Hitler in 1923 with the putsch, and of course various activities, politically in the streets with riots, with the communist elements and all. The German army at this time, you must also keep in mind, due to the upheaval and the change in government, primarily was the guardian of the state. They were going to protect against the elements which were trying to overthrow, such as the communists or the socialists. Here we see Adolf Hitler with two of his higher command officers. On the far right is Field Marshal Keitel, and in the middle is General Oberst Jodl, or Colonel General Jodl, and of course on the left is Adolf Hitler. With the movement of the Nazi Party and Hitler coming to power in 1933, the German officer corps saw one thing. They had risen to a state which, again, even though under civil government, had power. They were primarily made up of noblemen with other elements mixed in. However, Adolf Hitler saw them as his answer to success. The German officer corps and the tradition, which had evolved now up to this point in 1933, is something that he really disliked tremendously. He didn't like noblemen. He was basing his whole platform on the common man, the ideals of the common person, and how we can bring them from unemployment and develop a society that way. The men that surrounded him in the German officer corps in these early stages, he had to rely on, simply because they were the answer to what he wanted to achieve. But he disliked them tremendously. And therefore, men like Field Marshal von Manstein, whose family went back to about 1300, was a nobleman. But yet, he was one of the more senior officers in the German officer corps, and he couldn't do without them. Otherwise, where would he have that stabilizing element? We see another gentleman who became a very predominant element in his military. This is Freiherr von Fritsch. Freiherr in German means baron. However, this gentleman who represented the nobility in 1938 was dismissed by Hitler. It was a plot to get him out because things would change, as we will see. This is General von Manteuffel. He, being a nobleman, was the younger generation in this traditional set of officers. And the three men that I've showed you, it's rather interesting to note that they represented one of three groups. This was the traditional group, the men who believed in the state. By the state, I mean the old monarchical way of doing things, the Prussian discipline. Nothing to do with the Third Reich in the sense of politics, Adolf Hitler, or the blind obedience that he was going to demand with a political orientation to it. And this is General Bulk. On the left here, on his right, is his chief of staff, a nobleman as well. His name is von Millentine. In fact, on the bibliography that I've given you, the man on the right has written two of the books in there that are very interesting. But here again, you have two men who are elements of that younger generation of noblemen who were supporting the German army, and in this case they were frontline officers, as General von Manteuffel was. This is the second group. This was a group that perhaps some have said dominated the officer corps. I don't believe so. I feel that they were an element, but not a great element. These were the party men. Men who adhered to Adolf Hitler for several reasons. Perhaps to gain position, to maybe rise in rank in some way or another. There were several different theories to why such a man as Blumberg, who became the Minister of Defense, would adhere to Adolf Hitler's way of thinking. But if one thinks about it, Adolf Hitler went about coming to power in a very unique way. He never really set forth his dialogue as far as the traditional element of the German army. The officer corps was always going to play a role. Blumberg was a man who, I believe, in good faith, felt that this was the way it was going to be. However, he too was dismissed after a number of years, simply because he was a noble element and he had been used as far as he could be used. Even though he did continue to support Hitler from behind the scenes as a private citizen, the intrigue behind his dismissal was a bit off color. And I'll tell you this just quickly, in order to get men like him out, they would perhaps say that your wife had been a former woman of the streets. They would have documentation, and this was the case with von Blumberg. And of course, if you had that type of reputation or wife, you were not a noble general staff officer and you would be dismissed. This is another part of that party element. But this group here, and you'll see the skull and crossbones, represents a political military group known as the SS, or Waffen-SS. Waffen in German means combat. This element was a very strong force in two ways. First of all, it did support Adolf Hitler. It was Adolf Hitler's Praetorian Guard, if you want to say this. They also were a young group of individuals, a new military organization which had been developed under him. And so they believed firmly in what Adolf Hitler had to say, especially the officers. And many of the men who joined the Waffen-SS were former officers in the army. But they were not noblemen generally. There were very few noblemen that joined the Waffen-SS. They were more from the middle class, lower class element, many men who had been even non-commissioned officers. One man who arose to a position in the Waffen-SS was Sepp Dietrich. I don't know if the name is familiar to you or not. He at one time had been Hitler's chauffeur. He had been a sergeant in World War I. He rose to a four-star general in the Waffen-SS. It was brought to my attention one time in discussing with General Beaumont, who had served along with Dietrich in the Battle of the Bulge. I said to him, what kind of man was Dietrich? Was he qualified? I've always heard that it was a very politically oriented corps. And he says, oh yes, he said, he was a talented man. Beyond being Hitler's chauffeur, he said he did have some military insight. However, beyond a regiment, I don't think he could have done much. He said, of course, he commanded an army in the Battle of the Bulge of about 400,000 men. So from a regiment to 400,000 men, one can imagine that his skills were a little bit limited when he got to that level. But this second group, and with the Waffen-SS, made up a very strong threat to the German officer corps and army. It was politically oriented, it did support Adolf Hitler, and it came pretty close to 1 million men with all of its divisions. They had tank divisions, infantry divisions, grenadier divisions. They were well equipped, and their officers were very well trained. You might make a comparison that they were like the Green Berets in many aspects. They were extremely trained in combat, and they were well indoctrinated in combat as well. They had severe losses. But this element here was another stabilizing factor for Adolf Hitler. It was also a destabilizing factor for the German officer corps and the army as we know it. This is the third group. This man, I don't know if you recognize, you should, I'm positive you've heard about him. Films, books have been written about him, numerous ones. This is Erwin Rommel. Erwin Rommel was the son of a school teacher. He came from a background of a middle-class German family in southern Germany, actually southwest Germany, Württemberg, where several officers came from who served in the German officer corps. However, he did not come from an officer family where their heritage went back 200 or 300 years. He did not come from a noble family. However, he did get in because of qualifications prior to World War I to a cadet school and worked his way up. But this type of officer, the third element in the Third Reich, or the German officer corps of this time, was more of a passive, a neutral type of officer, who professionally did what they had to do and had blinders on much of the time. Even though Adolf Hitler used him as a propaganda element, he really did not pay a tremendous amount of attention to Hitler. He was not politically oriented to any degree. His main focus was his activity at the front. He was a frontline commander. He did very well tactically, and of course Hitler could make a hero of him, which he did. Of course, this would eventually backfire, as you might well know, in 1944, after the plot against Adolf Hitler to kill Hitler. Rommel was implicated. Not necessarily was he a main element, which he was not, but his name had been mentioned. So he was given the choice. Do you want a dishonorable discharge and be disgraced, or do you want to take poison? He took the poison in order to maintain his honor as a German officer and a field marshal. So this is how the third element evolves. This is another gentleman in that group. He was a passive individual and more or less a man who evolved again from a middle-class background. His name is Franz Halder. And Franz Halder came from Bavaria, but he succeeded a man who had been a nobleman. Hitler chose him simply for one reason, because he was not a nobleman and he had a rather passive way about him. He did not feel that there would be any resistance. So this third group represents an element where professionally they will do their job, but I won't get any flack. There will be no major questions. I will dictate what I have to militarily, and they will accept it, pretty much. However, Halder was involved in a plot to kill Adolf Hitler in 1938. It was not a plot which did evolve to fruition in the sense of actually attacking Hitler or a movement to assassinate him at any one point. But he was within a group which focused on the idea of eliminating him. However, at the juncture when it became important to make a decision about this gentleman backed out. And he continued in utter silence to do his professional duty up until 1942, when Adolf Hitler did not really care for his opinion about the war in Russia. Franz Halder's career ended in 1942. Later, to end up in a concentration camp and at the end of the war be released by the Allies. In fact, this gentleman worked for the U.S. Historical Division following World War II up until about 1968. This is where I came in contact with him. With the three elements described, you can have a better understanding now as we get into the development of the war. We've gone through a period of where Hitler was making a choice of who was going to serve in his army. He needed the tradition, but yet, as he moved closer to building the army that he wanted, in 1936, mass conscription took place. This brought about a whole change in the officer corps as well. All of a sudden, any element could be within the German officer corps. Any element. And also, you had an army that was made up of a cross-section of the German population. And this was something that the German officer corps prior had never known. It finally had to come into contact socially with the lower level of German society. That means non-commissioned officers, privates, and to develop a relationship, because the Third Reich and the ideology that Hitler espoused, or Rosenberg, his philosopher, was that the mass, and to develop this unification. So as we evolve through this time of dismissal of the certain noble officers, the heterogeneous movement of Hitler's philosophy to unify the German military and political military, the Waffen-SS, into one massive machine, the war takes on a whole new dimension, because the officer corps itself was really not prepared for war, mentally and physically, especially mentally. They had advised Adolf Hitler many times against attacking France, even Poland in 1939. Their apprehension, of course, was dispelled by the mere fact that Hitler was victorious, the Blitzkrieg. However, as we near the point of 1941 and the attack on Russia, they are very weary. They realize that they have to have time to build an army. And they were advising Hitler of this. But here comes the real collapse of the German officer corps. Hitler didn't want to hear negativisms. And again, it was based on the nobility is the element, they're traditional, and they are trying to discourage, and they are negative, and I don't want them to head my officer corps anymore. So with the attack on Russia in 1941, many of the officers who were of noble or old officer tradition or culture were dismissed within the first year of the attack on Russia. And as things became more involved, and as the German military discovered that it did not have the wealth of materials that it needed, as most of the old officers understood, they were positive in one thing, that you cannot win, especially against a country of this size. You cannot have a two-front war. That was already proven from World War I. But again, Hitler had dismissed most of these men, and those who were left were men such as General von Manteuffel, a younger element in that first group that I had pointed out to you. Here, seen in Romania in 1944, he was a division commander. Now, the Russian front was collapsing, and we would soon see, too, in June of 1944, the Allies would set foot en masse on the shores of Normandy. And of course, the German army knew that the two-front war was failing. However, it was men like General von Manteuffel who did see one optimistic note in all of this. It was not to have victory. It was not to support Adolf Hitler. But it was to bring about an end to World War II in such a way that there was not chaos, that there was not disaster, and that they could withdraw to the borders of Germany and perhaps stabilize under Allied control some kind of new government, and Germany would remain somewhat intact, because the officers on the Western Front were perhaps more in, how could I say, maybe more in a passive way, able to justify their situation with the Allies because of the lack of severity in the attitude. The men on the Eastern Front were certainly in a situation where they had to defend every inch of ground, even though it was defensive, not offensive, simply because the nature of the Russian. We have to remember that approximately 22 million Russians died in World War II. And as the onslaught had taken place in the early years in the Russian campaign, the Russians remembered this well now that they were on the offensive. So this type of officer from the first group, who really was rather offensive to Hitler still in many ways, being noble, he had to come to rely on, because they were the last hope for defending Germany, his ideals, and they were well aware of what the situation was and capable of perhaps bringing it to a negotiated end. Here is a picture of General von Manteuffel with Adolf Hitler. And this was in 1944 as well. Again, I'm pointing out the fact that Hitler had to rely on these men. Years prior, after he dismissed the majority of the older, more superior officers from the officer corps, he would not have associated with these men or have taken them into his confidence. However, Manteuffel and General Balk were two which he had to rely on. it was the last bastion. As we see here, this is a shot of D-Day. The movement towards the end is near. The Allies have reached the shores in 1944. And a man such as General Gunther Blumentritt, who represents the third group, the men who are professionals, again demonstrated professionally as officers that they would defend Germany because they knew ultimately what the end would mean. And in this particular case, General Blumentritt, who was of that more passive professional group, a very commendable man in the sense of standards as far as a general staff officer, demonstrated, even though he knew about the plot against Adolf Hitler shortly after the invasion in 1944, that it was better to allow the Allies a foothold and through attrition to wear down rather than to support Adolf Hitler's demands to hold the Allies at the shores. So in a way, the officer corps now, which was in its demise, these men realized that it was pretty much over. Their position as a state within a state since about 1935 had really diminished, that finally the tradition was going to be coming to an end. But yet they were doing everything in their power to preserve Germany as a country and the civilian population. This is a photo of the Ardennes and General von Manteuffel, along with General von Manteuffel is the second from the right, and second from the left is a man who was a great supporter of Adolf Hitler. His name is Field Marshal Model. And ironically enough, this picture kind of symbolizes something here. Manteuffel was the younger Prussian officer who represented perhaps the last hope. Adolf Hitler had selected him to head a panzer army of 300,000 men to defend against to assault the Allies, I should say, in the Ardennes, as the last hope of cutting them off and making a defense at Antwerp. And Field Marshal Model represented a man of middle-class origin who had arisen to be a field marshal, yet was of, as I say, middle-class stock and supported Adolf Hitler. The irony in this picture comes down to the fact that Model, I don't know if you can see it too well, but in his left eye he's wearing a monocle. In 1942, General von Manteuffel had refused to take, this was on the Russian front, I should clarify that, serving under Field Marshal Model, General von Manteuffel refused to send his troops into battle without proper winter clothing, white, so that they couldn't be shot down. All they had on is their drab green, and it was not winter clothing either. And he said, I refuse to send my troops into battle. At that time, Model, who again was a very ardent supporter of Adolf Hitler, wanted him court-martialed. Fortunately, through internal politics of the officer corps, Manteuffel was sent back to France for rest and relaxation, and the issue was dismissed. However, he was dismissed simply because an uncle of von Manteufel's intervened, who was a nobleman, and for some reason changed the course of action there. However, this is 1944. Here are these two gentlemen. When Manteuffel came to Field Marshal Model's headquarters to talk for the first time, there was a question mark in his mind. First of all, this man is a supporter of Hitler. He will fight to the last man. And what can I expect? He wanted to court-martial me at one point. As he came in and we discussed the situation, as it was, Model in his parting words said, Manteuffel, you're a nobleman. You wear regular glasses, and you can see his glasses on him there. He said, you know, being a nobleman, you should wear a monocle like I wear. And he handed him one. Manteuffel said, but Herr Field Marshal, I'm not accustomed to squinting like this and contorting my face. He says, you know, it'd be very uncomfortable. He says, furthermore, I don't know if I can read just with one glass. Well, he left, and Model didn't say anything after that. And when I saw Manteuffel, he pulled out this monocle one time at his home, said to me, he said, you know, this is the only decent thing he tried to do, and yet it would never work. He says, I could never understand how these men could do this, and yet he came from the aristocracy who were supposed to be wearing these. Yet here was an officer who did not come from that tradition and was wearing one. So it's kind of ironic. At this point in Modal's career, he was becoming more convinced than ever that the war was lost, and did support Manteuffel throughout their last efforts. And it is kind of ironic, too, that Modal, shortly after this photo, a month or so, did commit suicide. This is the evolution of the Ardennes offensive, as we can see it here in this picture, which is symbolized by these SS soldiers. Defeat was imminent, and of course, as the defeat proceeded to hamper the amount of weapons and the supply lines and the communication lines to Germany, and the retreat across the Rhine, and things were closing in, we end up with rubble. And this primarily is what happened to the German officer corps, that its decline turned into rubble pretty much because they were a dysfunctional institution. They no longer had a corps. Hitler died, of course, in April of 1945, and they no longer even had a military leader, so to speak, who they had sworn an oath to. Admiral Dönitz had taken over, but there was very little confidence in him because of the lack of time. And so that's pretty much an outline of how the German officer corps was. It was, of course, based on militarism. And I'd just like to part with this quote, which was written by a man by the name of Alfred Vox. He was an expert and has written, as I say, a book on militarism about really what the German officer corps represented up until the last. And it's, quote, militarism, on the other hand, presents a vast array of customs, interests, prestige, actions, thought, associated with armies and war, and yet transcending true military purposes. Indeed, militarism is so constituted that it may hamper and defeat the purposes of the military way. Its influences are unlimited in scope, and it may permeate all of society and become dominant wherever its focus. And this is kind of an interesting statement because they were an influence on all facets of German society. And as we see at the very end, what it turned into. The whole German society succumbed to the defeat. And never again would the German officer corps rise, because it never would have that impetus, it never had that tradition of 270 years behind it. So at that point, World War II really was the last of the German officer corps as one had known it for that period of time. So that's all I have to say. Are there any questions that you care to ask? None?
Who was the chancellor that you said was forced to resign?
His name was Hollweg. He was a man who originally had supported the Kaiser and the German officer corps in World War I, but as 1916 became a year of collapse, and Ludendorff and Hindenburg were taking over, they did not necessarily see him as the man that they wanted, because he did not condone the idea of increasing U-boat warfare, and they wanted to annex more of the Soviet Union or Russia, and he did not. They wanted these, annexation, I guess is a better word to use, and he was not in compliance with that. So they decided to send a note to the emperor that he should be replaced, and so he was. Anybody else? Yes?
They had a movie now, I think it was called Last 10 Days.
Yes.
Is that how it really happened in the end? How he killed himself?
I think, was that the one with Anthony Hopkins?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay. Yes, you're referring to Hitler?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Hitler did kill himself. It was with the cyanide capsule, and also a revolver was supposedly used too. But there are several sources who will verify the fact that he was dead, even though they like to maintain the mystique and that perhaps he's somewhere. Is he really dead? Is he in South America like Beaumont or whatever? But two officers that I did know who were in the bunker, it was verified to them after they left the bunker that he was dead. And they're pretty sure that he did die, and they're simply for the fact that he was not going to leave Berlin. Anybody else?
Thank you very much, Don.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Hitler's probably hanging around with Elvis Presley. Is what
That could very well be at a Kmart, yes. It's, again, the bibliographies that I've given to you,
Everybody has one.
these books can be found generally at any library or through interlibrary loans.